Hello and welcome everybody to another session of Cooperation Tulsa's Organizer Education Group. We're continuing our reading of a Full Spectrum Resistance Volume 1. I think we're probably around halfway through. No, a little bit further than that. I'd say we're probably about like 75% of the way through Full Spectrum Resistance. Just want to remind anybody who's listening or watching, I suppose, that all of the previous sessions are uploaded both to the Anark YouTube and to the Cooperation Tulsa YouTube. So if you want to get caught up, you can just go back and listen to those whenever you please. However, if you'd like to be part of the discussion that we have when we do these reading groups, you should go over to Cooperation Tulsa's Open Collective, which is where we solicit donations and recurring donors, and become a donor for whatever amount you like. And after that, reach out to us and we'll invite you to the Cooperation Tulsa Discord. You can talk with people in Cooperation Tulsa, and you can become part of these reading groups that occur every Monday, alternating Mondays. So if that sounds like something you want to do, the organization is definitely trying to raise money right now. So that's absolutely something you can contribute to the longevity of Cooperation Tulsa. Yeah, but we got 3 readers. I am going to spread this link around just a little bit before we get started. How's everybody doing tonight? Tired as usual. Why are you tired? Dang, that sucks. What about duct tape? Is that reasonable? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's see here. Almost got it set up. There we go. All right. Put it in the place. I did the thing. So, Zan did us the kindness of putting where we ended last time in the organizer education chat there. So I would have forgotten otherwise. Looks like we are in the middle of discussing the Deacons of Defense. We're talking. This little section here says to do direct action. Let's see here. Let's just, I would say, start from the top of this heading. I'll get us started here. To do direct action. Of course, underground groups have organized throughout history for many different forms of direct action, from the saboteurs of the South African MK to the modern Earth Liberation Front and Animal Liberation Front. My point, I hope, is clear. Underground organizations have a long, important, and honorable history and struggles for justice. Throughout this book, I'll refer to underground movements and I'll discuss the specifics of underground resistance. Of course, most people do not work underground and do not intend to. So, why is this important? Everyone in a resistance movement should understand why movements benefit from diverse approaches and how movements can be strengthened by clandestine organizing. I want people to understand that the role that organized or underground groups have played in the past so that they are not swept under the historical rug as unorthodox groups like the Deacons for Defense often are. The history of underground resistance is full of stories that are relevant, interesting, and inspiring. I also want these stories told because they help to put risk in perspective. For many people in the liberal tradition, even the idea of getting arrested is scary, and doing something that could lead to months or years in prison is out of the question. When we know the stories of resistors who gave up everything, their freedom, even their lives, to work underground, we set for ourselves a higher standard of courage and self sacrifice. Also, if we do live in a place with a permissive political climate, we can't rely on that situation continuing forever. Quite the opposite. There's been a turn toward increasing surveillance culture and repression of dissent, even in countries that have traditionally been tolerant. Whether you like it or not, there may be a time when you support or even depend on an underground group. Underground networks take a long time to form and consolidate for reasons of security. If a resistance movement is going to have underground networks when they are urgently needed, the process of building them must start well in advance. The conflicting needs of above ground and underground organizations is an important and complicated subject. To give it the discussion it deserves, I'll talk about it in more detail in the next chapter. For now, consider this: being open or closed specifically is not by itself a determining factor in success. What is important is to find a point on this continuum that matches up with a group's tactics, philosophy, and political context. Next.
I don't think I could hear myself just earlier.
Yeah, so earlier I just had myself on the stage, and I think they can hear you on the stage now. Will you say something?
Yes, testing one, two.
And so now we just check the live stream and see if that went through. Pretty sure it did. I mean, I can see what the problem was. Give me a sec. Just keep speaking.
Okay, yeah, I heard myself. Okay, moderate versus militant. Are groups more effective when they are well behaved and play by the rules of those in power, or when they do everything they can to disrupt the normal functioning of dominant systems of power? Gamson confirms the primacy of disruption and defiance. He found that groups willing to use unruly tactics to disrupt, discredit, or embarrass their opponent were much more likely to succeed. In the same vein, Gamson investigated what kinds of goals made for effective organizations. Not surprisingly, he found that revolutionary groups had a very low success rate in achieving their objectives. We know this since there was no successful revolution in the United States between 1800 and 1945. That said, groups with more radical goals met success at about the same rate as groups with lesser demands. Given this, it does make sense to pursue more ambitious goals rather than holding back. At the very least, a militant approach gives a group more bargaining power and greater ability to provoke concessions. Those in power sometimes try to blunt movement militancy by offering concessions. Gamson found that groups focused on a single objective were more likely to succeed than groups with multiple issues and goals. Gamson's conclusions suggest that an ideally effective group would be militant, combat ready, and well organized, with clear goals. Its goals would be radical, and it would generally choose one short term goal at a time to throw its resources behind. And in pursuing that goal, it would ignore or deliberately reject the establishment's bounds of respectable protest to gain the advantage of being unruly. Gamson also suggests that whether a particular group is competing with other groups that have similar goals doesn't seem to make a big difference. However, when competing groups had different levels of militancy, the moderate groups tended to be more successful at the expense of the militant. That's radical flanking from chapter 3 at work. Some of Gamson's most interesting findings have to do with violence. Gamson's definition of violence includes property destruction, which I disagree with and which confuses matters slightly. But we can still learn a lot from his startling results. In the beginning of his study of organizations using violence, Gamson asks, quote, "What is the fate of these groups? Are the users of violence crushed by adverse public reaction and the coercive power of the state? Do the recipients of violence rouse the public sympathy who are appalled at their victimization and join them in the struggle?" End quote. He found that groups who used violence had a specific sorry. He found that groups who used violence had a significantly higher success rate than those who did not. On the other hand, groups that were physically attacked but refused to use violence in their own defense had a negligible success rate in this study, which seems low and is probably due to the low sample size and pre-civil rights time frame. Gamson concludes, quote, "With respect to violence and success, It appears better to give than receive. End quote. Next.
It, it's worth quoting his conclusions at length as he compares the results of his study to popular leftist opinions on violence. Specifically, the data undermine the following line of thinking. Violence is the product of frustration, desperation, and weakness. It is an act of last resort by those who see no other means of achieving their goals. In this view, the challenging group, frustrated by its inability to attract a significant following and gain some response from its targets of influence, turned to violence in desperation. However, this merely hastens and ensures its failure because its actions increase the hostility around it and invite the legitimate action of authorities against it. When social movements are attacked but refuse to use violence, the conventional argument goes, this attempted repression simply adds fuel to the fire, bringing new allies to the cause of the challenging group and increasing its chances of ultimate success. However compelling these images may be, they clearly do not fit the data presented here. The interpretation I would suggest is almost the opposite. Gamson argues that the use of violence grows from an impatience born of confidence and rising efficacy, rather than the opposite. Hence, the users of violence tend to be larger groups, and the recipients of violence tend to be smaller. Gamson concludes that it is not the weakness of the user, but the weakness of the target that accounts for violence. In any case, and this fits well with my argument for full spectrum resistance, those who use violence in Gamson's study did not use it as their primary tactic. Typically, it was incidental to the primary means of influence, strikes, bargaining, propaganda, and other nonviolent means. It is the spice, not the meat and potatoes. His analysis does not show that violence by itself increases success, but it does show that the use of violence by a resistance group does not lead to failure all or even most of the time. Next.
I think that's me. So we remember that we're in the section where we're talking about the, I don't know what you call them, the conflicting ideas of organization. It has something to do with like tensions, organizational tensions, I think is what it's called. This is the tension between anything goes and a code of conduct. Effective groups often reject the established boundaries of acceptable protest, but that does not mean that they reject all bounds on acceptable behavior or that their main purpose is to break boundaries or to simply infuriate the establishment. Often, it's quite the opposite. Members of many effective resistance movements have abided by a strict moral code, and they've not followed that code of conduct purely for personal reasons. They have followed it because group pressure and social norms encouraged them to abide by it. Formal codes of conduct tend to focus on themes like basic ethics and good conduct, movement goals and political education, security culture and non-collaboration, discipline and loyalty, and organization and general duties. I discuss some examples in more detail in further resources. Other organizational factors. Finally, Gamson looked at a few other factors of interest. One was sponsorship and privilege. He found that groups with wealthy or influential backing had only a slightly higher success rate than those with fewer resources. This may have to do with strategic capacity, which, as I'll discuss in Chapter 12, may be stronger in groups with fewer resources. It may also be that groups with wealthy backers are more vulnerable to political co-optation, like the nonprofit industrial complex discussed in Chapter 10. World events had some impact on the success of different groups. Whether the times were generally turbulent had little effect. But war made a difference. Groups that made their challenge during wartime had significantly higher success rate, perhaps because those in power were already under great pressure externally, and they could relieve some of that pressure internally by giving in to demands. Groups that worked during wars and economic collapse had a higher chance of success if they established themselves in advance of the crisis, rather than after its onset. Gamson writes that a group that has organized or, quote, has organized itself for a long battle is in a position to exploit the opportunity presented by a crisis, end quote. Jack Goldstone, who modified and reanalyzed Gamson's data, agrees. In fact, he found that one of the biggest factors for success was whether a group could organize until a crisis opportunity came up. Quote, in short, there is a near perfect match between periods of protest group success and periods of broad crises, end quote. He writes that almost any organized group, quote, has excellent chances of eventually attaining its aims, provided it maintains its challenge until a crisis arises that makes success likely, end quote. Why can crisis help if we are prepared? A crisis can help us mobilize people. It can temporarily increase people's willingness to participate, their commitment to struggle. But a crisis does not organize people. We still need to deliberately build groups and networks, share radical analysis, and build skills. When we have taken the time to organize and reach out, a crisis can allow us to mobilize very effectively. On the other hand, if we refuse to reach out and organize, there's a risk that some of the people we could have mobilized for resistance will instead be mobilized by other forces and even by authoritarians. Next.
In Goldstone's analysis, bureaucratic groups took slightly longer than non-bureaucratic groups. But that doesn't mean that those groups were necessarily impeded by formal organizing. It may be that groups, knowing they had a long struggle ahead, chose more formal approaches to keep their movements together over time. So when we look at an informally organized group in history that won quickly, we have to ask, did it win quickly because it was an informal group? Or did an informal group win quickly because its struggle was shorter and easier to begin with? If it had to deal with a longer and more difficult struggle, if it had to build an enduring organizational base, would it too have developed more formal networks? Crisis can be beneficial or very dangerous. Witness the Wobblies and other movements suppressed during any number of wars. The Wobblies lacked enduring organization, while other groups that were better prepared were in a better strategic position to exert force or extract concessions. Whether a crisis is ultimately beneficial or damaging to a resistance group depends heavily on whether they are organized and prepared. Organizational snapshots. We can visualize all these tensions by graphing I can't say that word today. Organizational snapshots, summarizing this information in a way that lets us quickly compare different organizations. In the snapshots below, each gray band shows an organizational tension, big versus small, centralized versus decentralized, and so on. The black bar shows roughly where a given group operated on that spectrum. Sometimes the bars are wider. This suggests that the group either used more of the spectrum or changed over time. So, first snapshot, for a consciousness raising group, often more small than big, decentral than central, more informal than formal, more consensus-based than hierarchical, more open than clandestine, more moderate than militant, but goes a bit to the militant side, and more anything goes than code of conduct. Many movements in their early stages use consciousness-raising groups to spread. These tend to be small and highly participatory groups, as shown above. Barriers to entry are low. Sometimes they become more militant, but if they want to become more effective as a militant group, they tend to move away from the organizational choices they originally made. Another snapshot for the Deacons for Defense. I guess they were a medium group. Smack in the middle of decentral versus central. Bit more formal than informal. Slightly more hierarchical than consensus-based. bit more clandestine than open, much more militant than moderate, and much more based in a code of conduct than anything goes. The Deacons for Defense are a perfect example of an organization designed to be based in community while engaged in dangerous struggle. They found a good balance between many different organizational tensions and did their job very well. Next.
Groups that are fighting an outright war tend to move even further along towards centralized, highly structured organizations. Sorry. So we have the guerrilla paramilitary snapshot, which for the small and big, it's pretty much in the middle, but they are very centralized, very much on the formal side, very hierarchical, some level of openness, but very much on the clandestine side, very militant, and very much a code of conduct. So any number of armed paramilitaries from the ANC's armed wing to the North Vietnamese army look like that particular snapshot. Okay, then we have the Weather Underground organizational snapshot. So kind of toward the smaller size, but definitely more in a little bit toward the middle. On the centralized side, as far as formal and informal, it's toward the middle, slightly weighted toward the formal side, as well as the hierarchy is slightly weighted, but it's kind of in the middle. Clandestine is very much on the clandestine side versus open. They are also militant and have what looks like a slight code of conduct, but also drifting a little bit toward the anything goes side. The Weather Underground's organizational profile had a lot in common with the guerrilla paramilitary as a result of a conscious decision on their part to model themselves after organizations like the NVA. Then we have the next one, which is the Black Panther Party. Slightly toward the bigger side, definitely toward the centralized side on that metric. Then we have a little bit more toward the formal side, a little bit more toward the hierarchical side. The open and clandestine is a very large bar, so it's kind of going across the whole gamut there. So it looks like they had a pretty wide range of open as well as clandestine activity. Kind of the same thing with the moderate versus militant. I mean, it's tending toward the militant side, but it's also across much of the spectrum. And then we have the anything goes, kind of weighted toward that side, with the bar extending into the code of conduct as well. So, a little bit more of a spectrum there as well. The contemporaneous Black Panthers had more in common with the Deacons for Defense, though they were more centralized and ran a wider variety of social programs. And then if you scroll down, then we have Liberal Mass Movement, which is going to be weighted toward the big side, very centralized, very formal, weighted toward the hierarchical side, but open instead of clandestine on that side, moderate instead of militant, and an anything goes approach instead of the code of conduct. Liberal mass movement organizations like modern Greenpeace or the Council of Canadians tend to have a characteristic shape to their snapshot, a diagonal slash that indicates a big centralized organization tending towards mass inclusion with low barriers to entry and low militancy. So then we have the Earth Liberation Front, Animal Liberation Front, operating cells. And the first one is very much weighted toward the smaller side and decentralized as opposed to centralized. The informal versus formal is slightly toward the informal side, but more in the middle. The consensus hierarchy is weighted toward the consensus side. all the way over on the clandestine side, and then as well as the militant. Those are both on the far side of those spectrums. And then the code of conduct and the anything goes is slightly in the middle, more weighted toward the code of conduct side. Underground groups like the ALF or the ELF also show a diagonal swath, but going in the opposite direction. They are small, militant, and highly exclusive. They are contrasting, but organizationally complementary to large mass movements. Together, they would cover most of the organization. Can you scroll it up a little bit? I'm sorry. They are contrasting, but organizationally complementary to large mass movements. Together, they would cover most of the organization spectrums. And we have the Occupy movement. Pretty much in the middle as far as big or small, slightly toward the smaller side. Weighted all the way to the decentralized side, as well as the informal side and the consensus metric, as well as the open versus clandestine metric. Moderate versus militant is a longer bar again, with a little slightly going over into the militant side, but more on the moderate side altogether. And then the anything goes side for as opposed to the code of conduct, weighted to the anything goes. A snapshot of the Occupy movement at its height might resemble a conscious raising group or on a much larger scale, though sometimes more militant. Then we have the IWW, International Workers of the World. Right in the middle for the small big metric, a little bit weighted toward the centralized side. Pretty much in the middle for informal versus formal. Consensus and hierarchy also in the middle, but a longer bar there, so maybe a little bit of a compromise there. Then it's a little bit weighted toward the left on the open side as opposed to clandestine. A little bit more on the militant side for that metric, and then back to the anything goes side versus the code of conduct. The IWW is difficult to pin down precisely because of the many changes it went through during the first decades of its existence, but it most resembles the Deacons or the Black Panthers in its balance between different tensions. Yeah, I guess I'll go ahead and say next.
The American Federation of Labor in the early 1900s. So they're over on the far right side of the towards the big spectrum, also centralized, mostly formal, mostly hierarchical, almost entirely open on the moderate side, and towards anything goes. The Wobblies contrast dramatically with the AFL of the same time, which looks more like any modern liberal mass movement organization. All these organizational patterns can be effective and powerful tools for radical change when used appropriately. That's especially true when they work together in a movement. A large, moderate mass movement organization, allied with a smaller militant organization, can mobilize both large numbers and a broad range of tactics. A decentralized and unstructured organization like the Occupy movement might not be able to project well-planned militant action, but it may be able to politicize people and feed them into a mid-range organization structured like the Deacons for Defense. This complementarity is part of full spectrum resistance. See sidebar. Sidebar. Okay. Overlapping organizations in a movement. Okay, this is almost impossible to really describe. It's a bunch of different patterns, bars overlapping. It's a bunch of them overlapping with one another, different patterns on the same bar charts we've been talking about. A movement is made up of many overlapping groups. Strong movements can have complementary overlapping groups that can mobilize people from different groups and use different tactics. Here, overlapping organizational snapshots are shown for groups that could be found in the same movement, such as the civil rights movement. Together, they span the organizational tensions. Various Chinese rebellions in the mid 1800s had a similarly overlapping set of organizational characteristics and likely would have brought down the Qing dynasty if not for foreign intervention. So now I'll go back and finish what I was reading here. Small, decentralized, open organizations are well suited to accomplishing tasks like consciousness raising and propaganda with a low logistical overhead. In an ecology of resistance, these groups are like phytoplankton or mosses. They are small and simple. They require few resources to sustain themselves. These can be strengths. In the biosphere, simple plants have many strengths. They reproduce quickly, faster than they can be devoured by predators. They can capture loose carbon and nitrogen in useful forms that are passed through the food web to more complex organisms. Consciousness raising type groups can serve the same function. They take people who would otherwise just float loosely around mainstream society and integrate them into activist communities. And those people may go on to do all kinds of other work in different organizations. But such groups can only spread if they are able to overcome the horizontal hostility and isolation of a culture of defeat. A robust ecosystem, like a strong movement, is diverse. It has creatures of many different sizes and types, all participating in the same grand process. But it's often the small, simple ones that lay the groundwork, just as grasses in an empty field will hold and build the soil needed to one day grow a forest. Next.
Act up. Although movement strength comes from diversity, sometimes single groups can balance many different organizational tensions effectively. ACT UP is a great example and brings our story of organization full circle. In the 2 decades after Stonewall, the change in approach brought by gay liberation had mixed success. On one hand, major progress had been made in acceptance and social status, but there was also a new threat: AIDS. HIV/AIDS is not and has never been limited to gay people, but early researchers dubbed it the gay related immune deficiency or GRID. Early and well publicized outbreaks combined with existing prejudice doubly stigmatized gay people with HIV. This led to a fundamental medical misconception: AIDS was the gay disease. The magazine Cosmopolitan, for example, published an article by a doctor who said that a heterosexual couple with quote unquote healthy genitals would not spread HIV by having sex. Because of all this, very little medical funding was directed in the 1980s to help people with AIDS. The bigoted attitude of some politicians and public health officials was literally killing people. Effective action against the epidemic and against homophobia was urgently needed. Some activist organizations tried to address the emergency, including the gay men's health crisis. But they too often adopted the meek and accommodating attitude that had neutralized the Mattachine society. One of the founders of the gay men's health crisis, Larry Kramer, became disgusted with the approach of the organization he had helped to create. In 1987, he bemoaned the people who said, quote, "We've got to keep quiet or they will do such and such," end quote. Oh, they usually means the straight majority, the moral majority, or similarly perceived representatives of them, end quote. In an open letter, Kramer added, quote, "I cannot for the life of me understand how the organization I helped form has become such a bastion of conservatism and such a bureaucratic mess. The bigger you get, the more cowardly you become. The more money you receive, the more self-satisfied you are," end quote. So a group of activists, including Kramer, formed ACT UP in that year. Immediately, ACT UP began to use diverse and complementary tactics, choosing from a wide spectrum of action. Nancy Stoller wrote in Lessons from the Damned, quote, "What is most striking about ACT UP to many people is its effective use of graphics and media, an in-your-face style of direct action, and at the same time, an ability to negotiate with leaders in government in the health field using sophisticated technical analysis. The New York City organization combined these diverse strategies successfully due to its class and race base, its initial location in New York, and the movement past of its leaders. End quote. ACT UP organizers were influenced by direct action organizations of the past and by the civil rights struggle. ACT UP became famous for its posters and slogans. Their approach was blunt, brash, and deliberately provocative. One of their posters showed side by side a photograph of an unwrapped condom and the anti-prophylactic Pope wearing his phallic traditional hat. Know your scumbags, shouts the title. The text below the condom helpfully explains, quote, this one prevents AIDS. We'll return to ACT UP's effective use of media in Chapter 7, Communications. Next.
ACT UP's savvy media campaigns were paired with direct action. They weren't afraid to target homophobes wherever they found them. When ACT UP learned that a business called Fidelifax was investigating people to tell potential employers if they were gay, ACT UP picketed Fidelifax and got it put out of business by the New York State Commission. From the beginning in March of 1987, ACT UP used disruptive demonstrations in New York City. They blocked traffic and hung effigies in the street, forcing the FDA to accelerate HIV/AIDS drug testing. Nancy Stoller writes, during the next 7 months, New York ACT UP held 9 major demonstrations, was cloned in several cities, and produced a variety of graphics. The organization developed its signature style quickly, both organizationally and externally. The speed and efficiency with which ACT UP became effective was made possible by the increasing degree of organization within the gay community of New York, and for that matter, nationally. This social complexity was in turn the result of the gay liberation movement of the 70s. ACT UP was highly organized, but not rigidly organized. It was agile and disruptive because of its organization. Stoller writes, one of the major strengths of ACT UP has been its ability to provide a home for people with very diverse politics and commitments of time. This has been accomplished through a flexible structure and decision-making process. ACT UP's weekly meetings were mass assemblies with a clear process and routine. Robert's Rules of Order were used. There were 2 co-facilitators, one male and one female. At the start of each meeting, the 2 facilitators would read a statement of unity. ACT UP is a diverse, nonpartisan group united in anger and committed to direct action to end the AIDS crisis. We protest and demonstrate. We meet with government and public health officials. We research and distribute the latest medical information. We are not silent. People would applaud, and then any police were asked to identify themselves. Note, this doesn't work. See Chapter 6. New members were asked to identify themselves and were applauded. ACT UP's meeting approach revolved around community, focus, and participation. Stoller writes, all meetings followed a standardized schedule with normal, effective attempts to keep within a 2-hour time frame, even for the most important matters. Announcements were organized into groups of 5, and announcers went to the front of the room to speed things up and to make themselves visible as well. Committee reports were next. There were about 10 major committees to report, as well as a varying number of ad hoc committees. Stoller continues, next came proposals for ZAPs and actions. In ACT UP language, ZAPs are actions that can be organized within a week. An action is a more elaborate ZAP and may involve extensive media and other organizing work requiring several months to plan and execute. After all the proposals have been heard and voted on, those wishing to work on them left the main room to make a plan. In this way, ACT UP members literally voted with their feet to determine the amount of resources to be given to any particular project. Most actions were planned by an action committee. Actions had to be approved by consensus at weekly meetings, but rejected actions could still be organized by affinity groups, which formed on an ad hoc basis, officially outside of ACT UP. Vito Russo explained that if, quote, if anything gets voted down by the floor that maybe 10 or 12 people still feel very strongly about and still want to do, they formed what's called an affinity group. And that means that these people acting as a group and not as part of ACT UP are going to go ahead and do this whether anybody likes it or not. Russo noted, and so detractors of ACT UP are always saying, the business of affinity groups, you might say that they're not ACT UP, but they are ACT UP. And every time the floor votes something down, a dozen people go off and do it anyway. And the point, according to me, of course, is that they do it very well. And usually, not always, but usually when an affinity group goes off and does something on its own, they come back to the organization and they are applauded by the organization for what they've done. End quote. ACT UP is a perfect example of Hirsch's idea of a haven. It was a clearly focused group that offered a supportive environment for radicals and incubated militant action. But its diversity and strong community ties kept it from being isolated or marginal. ACT UP was extremely effective at fundraising because of both their mass media impact and their social connections. In 1989, they raised a whopping $600,000. Stoller explains the distinctive nature of ACT UP's public actions arose from its combination of direct action, civil disobedience, a focus on mainstream media, and its striking use of graphics. In the end, ACT UP's influence was profound and decisive. They fundamentally changed the attitudes towards HIV/AIDS in the American public, in the political establishment, and in public health. And by pushing for immediate HIV/AIDS research and healthcare early in the epidemic, they improved or saved thousands upon thousands of lives. Next.
All right. Well, we only got 10 minutes left, so I'm a little bit hesitant for us to start another chapter. Do we want to stop here and just let the discussion period go for 40 minutes instead of 30 minutes?
I'm down.
Okay. So, just opening the floor here. Oh, first let me record where we're at, but opening the floor here. Does anybody have any thoughts or anything to get our discussion started? So I think that there's a lot to discuss here in this organizational snapshot section. I think that there's a lot to this. I think last time we read this book, we spent a long time on this section. Anybody got any thoughts on the snapshots?
I was actually just going to comment about the part where it was a little bit before this, where they were talking about how when they embraced militancy, they had more success.
Yeah. I think that's a point that really needs to be made. And I think he does a good job in here talking about radical flanking. Like every time he's given the opportunity, his overall thesis is that radical flanking is what makes the, non-radical portion as successful as it is. That without a radical flank, that the non-radical portion will just flounder.
Yeah, makes sense.
Also, like the lesson of the importance of being prepared for success. Like if there's a huge event like a war that will lead to more people being mobilized because of the exceptional circumstances, if there's no organized organizations that they can join, they like either that those people, like those resources, this energy won't be used, or it will go to whatever is going to kind of fill that like power vacuum, and that could be authoritarian groups. That's no good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that the section here where it's talking about how having something organized ahead of time seems to be one of the most important parts. Is something I've been just screaming from the rooftops to the left for years now, and it was relieving to read it because it's like, damn, we need somebody saying that, you're not likely to just figure it out on the spot. You need to develop as much organizational complexity as you can beforehand, and that will probably determine your success when the crisis arrives. I think one of the interesting things here is this is probably one of the places in the organizational snapshots portion. This is one of the places that most clearly, I think, visually illustrates what he means by full spectrum resistance. You know, like you can kind of see what he means visually in these bar graphs. Anybody else have any thoughts?
Yeah, that graph is just like hard to take in, honestly. But I mean, I get it, but it's like I feel like the snapshots are more I don't know, just a better example, I guess.
Well, I think the point of those overlapping is the diversity of tactics. Like you said, Daniel, like the full spectrum resistance, but also another way of saying it, the importance of diversity of tactics to kind of like covered all kinds of different ways of organizing and like attract different like people who might be interested in like taking action, but might be interested in different things. And like also depending on the organization, but supporting each other too. Like a more like defensive organization, like the Deacons of Defense that would like support the freedom riders and stuff like that.
Logan put a quote here in the chat. He says, that made me think of this quote by Farge. Quote, from the beginning, we thought it would be fundamental not to construct an organization that, distant from struggles, writes documents and then goes into practice with the objective of adapting it to the theory. Likewise, it never appeared possible to us to conceive anarchist organization with only practice, but no theory, or even assuming as theory everything that happens in practice. We always sought a balance that, on the one hand, did not have as an objective to theorize deeply in order to begin acting, and on the other, sought to ensure that the action was in line with the theory, which, in our understanding, strengthens the results of militant effort without unnecessary loss of energy. Yeah, I mean that whole book is phenomenal. Social Anarchism and Organization is very, very crucial reading, I think. Anybody else have any sections that sort of stuck out to you? Any of these particular snapshots that caught your eye as we were reading through?
Yeah, I was just before you scrolled away from that other one, I was just thinking about the consciousness raising, how it was just like basically saying that that was only going to be done in like a small group setting. But it's just like a sad, commentary, I feel like, on, it's like there's so much consciousness raising that needs to happen. So, like, I would much rather see it being done on like a larger scale.
Yeah, well, it was occurring to me while I was reading this, while we were going through this portion, I was like comparing it to the free here in town, former for real economic emancipation. Um, it doesn't really fit. It is a consciousness raising group, but it is not, doesn't really fit this structure. I would say, if anything, it's trying to be big. It's like in the middle between decentral and central. It's very, very formal. It's like in the middle between consensus and hierarchy. It is very open. That part does fit. It is, I would say this moderate militant portion probably fits. Maybe a little bit more towards the militant, but mostly towards the moderate. And it is very code of conduct, not anything goes. So like kind of interesting that, even this example of a consciousness raising group is really not like universal of the potentials for consciousness raising groups. Anybody else have anything that stood out to them in the text? Did I move us out of the reading portion too fast? Do we need to go back to reading or?
LOL.
Yeah. I just didn't want to start chapter 6, because it's a whole other thing. Seems like it'd be better contained at another session.
Well, apparently in chapter 6 we do learn that the cops won't tell you that they're cops.
Wow, incredible. I'm glad we figured that one out.
What the heck?
Dang. I thought that was the trick. You said to go, now you have to tell me if you're a cop. And they go, you caught me.
Well, the only other thing I wanted to say is that, ACT UP is such a inspiring group. Everything that they've done and accomplished, and I really appreciated the snapshot of Larry Kramer's change when he saw that the organization he himself created didn't work. He was like, I'm leaving and starting something else, which I think is great. And also, if people are interested, there's a great movie called 120 BPM, or just BPM. It's a French movie, but I'm sure you can find it with subtitles. And it's not a documentary, it's like a fictionalized account of like an ACT UP group in France in the 80s. And I don't know, it's one of the best, if not the best, fiction movie I've seen about militancy, about activism. So I recommend it.
Yeah, I liked the discussion of ACT UP here. I liked it talking about how their use of affinity groups. That seemed like that's a pretty useful way to understand what a lot of anarchists advocate for, horizontal organizing, or is at least one option for what you can do. If you can't get consensus, that doesn't mean that the people who don't agree can't go just do the thing, you know? It just means that there won't be like universal buy-in. I mean, they can go off and do the thing, but that doesn't mean that they'll have like everybody's approval. So then they'll have to come back and show everybody what the results are. And that seems, it's a reasonable way to do a lot of things. I don't know if it's a reasonable way to do everything, but it's certainly reasonable on a lot of occasions to just do things that way.
Yeah, them having like 2-hour meetings with like with like 10 committees like reporting in and stuff like that. Like, I want to see that in action. Because that sounds like a very tight schedule.
Yeah, no doubt. Like, damn, people definitely got to know how long they're allowed to speak. seeing that go wrong in a lot of organizations where somebody just like sits there and talks for 10 minutes or whatever, and nobody tells them,
Yeah.
hey, we need to be respectful of people's time. Yeah, no, 10 committees. Yeah, I mean, like our report backs to the Cooperation Tulsa are usually like 6. We try to make it really short, but yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, that structure would be interesting to kind of dissect, and maybe there's probably other books about that. But
Oh yeah, so much has been written about ACT UP. They're one of the most analyzed organizations there is, I think.
Yeah, I like the detailed account of how they do things. It's like something that people can hopefully emulate. The like repeating the base of unity at the beginning and welcoming new members with applause. That's yeah, and everything else that was just mentioned. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I actually liked the part about them talking about just kind of the general flow and spirit of the meetings. You know, I liked, it starts with a statement of purpose, and then they like reward the new people. Like instead of just being like, what often happens, like, there's a circle and everybody just introduces themselves, and nobody makes like a big deal out of anybody who's new. But I actually kind of like that they like immediately they had like an organizational culture where it was like, no, yeah, you reward people when they show up. That's a good thing, make them feel proud that they're here. I think that's smart. What else do we got? Anybody else got any other thoughts?
I could read more.
Okay. Well, let's start chapter 6 then. Let's see here. So beginning, chapter 6, security and safety. This is a quote. It says, "Caution axiomatic, but overcaution results in nothing done. Those who bothered incessantly about security survived, but few of them had much beyond survival to their credit. To strike and then to survive was the real test." MRD Foote on resistance in Nazi-occupied Europe. Brandon Darby. New Orleans, 2007. A man named Brandon Darby becomes director of operations for the important grassroots relief organization Common Ground. Darby was one of the first members of the group. He's driven and militant, but many are unhappy with his approach. Some see him as aggressive, macho, and egotistical. He seizes the spotlight and always wants media attention to focus on him. Organizer Lisa Fithian, writing later on, argues that Darby's strong authoritarian tendencies, but his lack of organizing skills and experience, create discord. He bypasses other activists or bosses them around when he should be collaborating with them. He turns differences of opinion into disputes, and disputes into public conflicts. He likes to pick fights with the police and with other activists. To bolster his authority, Darby recruits a group of loyalists, pushing women and queer people out of leadership positions and replacing them with men who answer to him. He threatens people who question his authority and tries to purge longtime organizers from the group, eventually driving out some 30 volunteers. He reportedly sleeps with a lot of young female volunteers. While this is happening, he secretly approaches the police and the FBI and volunteers to work for them. Volunteers, wow. Possibly Darby's role in Common Ground is no longer feeding his ego enough. By late 2007, he is a paid informant. Darby gives detailed reports to the FBI on his conversations with other organizers, details about their lives, and the plans of groups he is working with. At a speaking engagement in Texas, he meets 2 young men, Bradley Crowder and David McKay. They look up to Darby. He is older, more experienced, and more militant than the younger activists. Darby arranges a meeting with them later at a coffee shop, insisting they sit outside so that no one can overhear their conversation. He would file a detailed report on their conversation with the FBI. He talks to them militantly about the need to escalate, but he also tries to undermine their confidence and tries to intimidate them physically, grabbing one by the head and squeezing, throwing another down onto the pavement without warning. He acts, in other words, like a bully, but he also gives them attention and establishes himself as their ally and mentor, quote unquote. Darby routinely arranges meetings with Crowder, McKay, and other young activists. He guides them, cajoles them, and often talks about the need for armed struggle. He cultivates, quote, his reputation as a hot-headed, militant revolutionary, end quote. In September of 2008, the Republican National Convention takes place in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Darby, Crowder, and McKay drive up from Texas in a van full of people, towing a trailer full of homemade shields Darby pushed them to create. On the drive, Darby talks about the need for armed confrontation. The RNC is the first big protest that Crowder and McKay have ever been to. Darby is their guide. But shortly after arriving, their homemade shields are confiscated by police who are getting regular updates from Darby. When he finds out the shields are gone, Darby flies into a rage. Exactly what happens in the ensuing conversation is unclear. Afterward, though, Crowder and McKay go to get ingredients for Molotov cocktails. Already sleep deprived, Crowder and McKay work late into the night, assembling the devices and discuss possibly property targets to use them on. The Jumbotron? A lot full of cop cars. But after the Molotov cocktails are actually made, they have second thoughts and decide that it's not a good idea to use them after all. Darby, staying at another location, harasses them all night with text messages. McKay sends a text message to Darby implying that he no longer wants to use the Molotovs. Darby texts back to call him a butthead. While Sarah Palin is getting out of bed for her public unveiling as vice presidential candidate, a SWAT team raids the place where Crowder and McKay are staying. The Molotov cocktails are found by the police with suspicious ease. Crowder and McKay are arrested and charged. They become known as the Texas Two. Bradley Crowder was 23 years old, sentenced to 2 years. David McKay was 22, sentenced to 4 years instead of 2 as punishment for insisting on a trial rather than pleading out. Crowder and McKay refuse to inform on one another. The FBI media storm is predictable. Crowder and McKay are called terrorists. The FBI claims that they were just barely able to interrupt a premeditated plan to burn dozens of people to death. Next.
Wait, who's this guy? He's awful.
Yes.
What the heck?
Brendan Darby. Yeah. Cautionary tale for security culture. After the raid, suspicions grow about Darby. Posters begin to show up in Texas warning that he is a snitch. Darby is at first defended by many of his close comrades. They can't believe it is true, but Darby soon admits it publicly. Darby becomes a hero to the right wing. He is lauded and given speaking engagements. All of a sudden, he loves Sarah Palin, but hates welfare and public health care. He gets the attention and ego boost he is looking for. In the aftermath, community organizers try to piece the story together. Lisa Fithian writes, quote, Brendan's behavior over the years makes it clear that he is a misogynist, an egomaniac, and a liar, end quote. On comparing stories, many people report that Darby had tried to goad them into reckless illegal action, including arson, in the past. There have been strange interactions between Darby and Cups for years previous. There are strong suspicions that Darby has been working for the FBI since much earlier than 2007. A former girlfriend believes he decided to inform around the time of Hurricane Katrina. And there are more deeply troubling events: suspicious break-ins, the poisoning of a woman's cat, and the disclosure that Darby informed on a Palestinian peace activist named Riyad Hamad. Hamad's house was raided by the FBI. He was later found dead, tied up, and drowned in the lake. The police called it a suicide. These revelations are shattering, but organizers do their best to heal and to learn. Tools for security. Resistance movements threaten the entitlement of powerful people and the functioning of entrenched systems of exploitation. Those in power will always try to infiltrate, attack, and destroy resistance movements. But resistance movements have powerful tools to protect themselves. In this chapter, I'll discuss how 4 different movements approach security in ways both good and bad. But first, I'll outline some of the fundamental tools for resistance security. Next.
Firewalls. Resistance movements protect themselves through a division between above ground and underground organizing. Most of us have worked in above ground groups. As discussed in the previous chapter, underground groups organize for many reasons, from escaping persecution to publishing underground newspapers to direct action. Above ground organizations work openly. They can communicate with and mobilize large numbers of people, most of whom take on low risk tactics. They rarely use tactics that are highly illegal or that require intense secrecy. Underground groups, on the other hand, are clandestine, small groups of dedicated people taking higher risk action. Underground groups protect themselves through secrecy, compartmentalization, and other scrupulous security practices. Above ground organizations, on the other hand, protect themselves mostly by building their numbers and by developing deep roots in communities of resistance. Above ground groups understand that they will face repression and attack, but they will be protected and supported by their allies. And if members of above ground groups face prison or death, other members of the community will step forward to take their place. The organizational needs of above ground and underground groups are fundamentally different because of this effective resistance groups usually have a clear dividing firewall between above ground and underground organizing. Members of an above ground resistance group cannot be simultaneously active in underground organizations. Breaking this rule makes it easy for the state to identify and track members of underground groups and infiltrate and compromise those organizations. It's also dangerous for those working above ground who may become involved in actions for which they lack adequate security. Members of underground organizations maintain a suitable cover, appearing mainstream or even conservative, while avoiding reckless or non-political crimes. It can be very dangerous to try and mix above ground and underground organizing in the same organization because their needs are so different. An above ground group with excessive secrecy and exclusion will become isolated or marginalized, losing the strength of numbers and community roots that above ground groups depend on. It will become easy prey for attack and repression. And a group that routinely breaks the law and threatens the powerful without adequate security will be short-lived. Security culture. That's bolded out. Security culture is another powerful tool for activist safety. At its core, security culture is based on the principle of need to know. In security culture, you don't ask questions about things you don't need to know. Say whether an acquaintance is a member of an underground group. And people who are involved in illegal or underground activities do not share that information with others. Security culture is very important and fundamentally simple, but it can seem complicated if you are new to it. On the following 2 pages is a summary of the basic ideas of security culture. Quote, security culture at a glance, unquote. This is the most useful as a refresher. If you are totally new to the concept, further readings can give you better grounding in the application of these core ideas. Next.
Keeping a low profile. People who want to use risky underground resistance, either immediately or at some point in the future, try to keep a low profile. They want to avoid leaving a quote unquote paper trail, literally or digitally, that would link them to militancy. This is both to avoid being flagged as a person of interest and to develop and maintain an innocuous cover story. The practice of keeping a low profile probably goes back as long as resistance does. Historian M.R.D. Foote discusses how resistors in occupied Europe avoided unwanted attention from the police and the Gestapo. Quote, what should a resistor do to keep himself secure among these uninformed and plain-clothed enemies? Keep alert. Keep to the rules. With his papers in perfect order, remember who he is, and above all, keep his mouth shut. Routine police methods are the same the world over. Your most successful resistor is therefore likely to be someone so ordinary looking that he will never attract a gendarme's second glance. So here's the gray box. Security culture at a glance. This short primer draws on Security Culture, a handbook for activists from tao.ca, available widely online. What is security culture? A way to make political communities safer, an intelligent response to current and past repression, a way to reduce paranoia through simple rules. Specifically for above ground activists, underground groups are stricters. Our underground groups are stricter. Don't, in public or private, don't talk about your involvement or someone else's involvement with an underground group. Talk about someone else's desire to get involved with such a group. Ask others if they are a member of an underground group. Talk about you or someone else's participation in illegal action. Talk about someone else's advocacy for such actions. Talk about your or someone else's plan for a future action. Talk about illegal actions in terms of specific times, peoples, places, etc. Talk to cops, federal agents, or intelligence officers at all. Let police into your home or work without a proper warrant. And give any information if arrested except name, address, and birth date. Precise law depends on situation and jurisdiction. 3 exceptions. There are 3 situations where talking about illegal action may be acceptable. 1. When planning an action with an affinity group in a secure fashion. Need to know. 2. Talking about past actions after arrest and conviction. Even then, be careful and don't implicate others. Arrestees may also need to talk about some actions under the guidance of a lawyer. And 3. Anonymous communiques to the media, carefully executed. Do support radical and militant resistance vocally. Security culture doesn't mean that people should never talk about illegal action at all. To the contrary, it's still acceptable, even encouraged, to speak out in support of monkey wrenching and all forms of resistance. Learn more and read more detailed security culture guidelines. Read security case studies and other guides. Learn about police pressure and interrogation tricks and threats. Watch Don't Talk to Cops on YouTube. Understand why people may breach security culture. Gossip or speculation, asking inappropriate questions, lying or bragging to gain credit, drug or alcohol use, starting or passing on rumors because they are informers or infiltrators. Intervene when you see security culture violated. Respond with reasonable escalation. First, educate, tactfully and privately if possible, and point people to further resources. Don't let violations pass or become habit. Chronic violators act as unwitting informers. They should be told to leave the group and organizing spaces. Understand, security culture is about reducing paranoia and making our communities safer. The main issue is behavior, not people. Above ground groups with good security culture will not pass on dangerous information, even if infiltrators are present. There are many behaviors that can disrupt groups or make them unsafe: sexism, racism, homophobia, and classism. Abusive behaviors and bad security culture can all destroy groups and are all are used by infiltrators and agents. Okay, so we read for a little while. We only got 10 minutes left. So I think this is a good place for us to stop the reading again. I will store this here. There we go. So we ended here right after the gray box about security culture. So last 10 minutes, anybody got any closing thoughts from what we read today?
Yeah, that first story is just kind of astonishing. That they would let somebody, like, that they wouldn't know him that well, to let him keep advancing in that organization. I don't know. But clearly he had ulterior motives from the beginning. I mean, I don't think he just turned conservative after some, I feel like that's something that's kind of always there.
Yeah, I've often kind of wondered like what the whole deal was there. Like what made him flip or whether he didn't flip, like you say, maybe he was just always kind of an infiltrator. But yeah, I mean, insofar as like him getting away with bad behavior, I think it really boils down to like that behavior is meant to crowd out all of the people who might have held him accountable. You know, he just basically like ostracized anybody who had healthy behaviors in the organization.
Yeah, and I mean, how is it that they don't go like even these Texas too? Like, how is it that they don't actually go after him to prosecute him for something? Like, I mean, it's very interesting, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were the target, of the law, so they probably weren't thinking very much about like countersuing Darby. But I think that what Darby did insofar as like trying to get people to do violent things, like that's like one of the biggest dead giveaways. Like somebody coming in and immediately trying to get everybody to talk about violence or doing something risky. That's like your most dead giveaway that there is. And it's not to say that some people don't just do that because they're just badly informed. Like, they could just have bad security culture and they come in and it's like, yeah, we all want to kill the rich, right? And, they take that attitude and they bring it in and then they're constantly trying to, no, even normal radicals can kind of just like be talking in this very violent, kind of casually violent way. But I think that, like the security culture thing said, that it's, what about when you start saying like instigating factors, specific times and places and suggesting certain people get involved in more violent, sort of terroristic activity. That's a big giveaway.
I mean, just like listening to that guy's personality, he's not somebody I would want to be associated with anyway. I don't
Yeah,
know.
no,
Very,
absolutely.
very striking.
I think that it kind of goes to show how that, our the left's culture, activist culture has changed. This was more normal, just like in the last few decades. These sort of like macho wreckers would just come in and do enormous damage and people would not call them out. They'd just let them accumulate power, or everybody that could try to call them out, instead they're the ones that would leave because they wanted to go form an organization without the wrecker. And I think that our culture has changed, thankfully, so that those people, the wreckers like Brandon Darby, are now the ones that are seen with suspicion instead of the people that they are targeting.
Yeah, I mean, was this guy like attractive? Was this like a honeypot? Like, what was happening?
I don't
I
know.
just don't understand like how he could be described as so badly, and they're like, yeah, like elevate him.
I mean, no, he doesn't really look like super attractive. He looks average. I mean, he's not like ugly.
Yeah.
He's just average, like doesn't look like he had some kind of like, hyper charismatic sexual appeal or anything.
Yeah. Well. Yeah,
Yep.
that's a fucking terrible story though. So yeah.
Logan said roasting bro Lamau. Yeah, I mean, he doesn't deserve anything better, Yeah, no, I mean, real piece of shit, went on and became like a fucking right-wing grifter. That's really like that's the easy way out in our culture. Oh, you just want to like lazily go make money easy, just go become a right-wing grifter. Just say whatever they want you to say. They will give you so much money. They'll give you a career.
It's not worth it to even get worked up to cancel anybody who's conservative because they just become rich instead.
Yes. Isn't that fucked up?
Oh, it's completely crazy, but yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, like the more you can ignore that, the better, really. But I mean,
yeah,
The people
Um,
that get the people that get worked up about it and try and do cancel culture, I'm just like, no, it doesn't work.
yeah, I mean, certainly doesn't work if they're willing to pivot to being a fucking grifter. It's like, nah, you're just helping them transition into a new career.
I mean, literally, just like a line of vitamins, some perfume, like they don't care. They'll sell anything.
Logan says, you go on Joe Rogan and you know you made it. Yeah.
What's Joe Rogan?
You joking? You fucking with
Yeah.
me right now? Okay. I hope so. I
Who's
was
that
hoping
guy?
so.
Oh, the guy from News Radio?
Yeah. You mean that comedian from like the 90s or whatever? Oh yeah, I remember
He was
that
like
guy.
a maintenance guy. He was the
Yeah.
maintenance guy on News Radio.
He's the lovable doofus. Right. That's
Yeah.
that guy, yeah. Oh, yeah, big changes since then. He's basically become a mouthpiece for the Jeffrey Epstein class. So,
Oops.
just thought I'd give you an update
Wait,
on that.
it turns out QAnon was fake? What?
Yeah, it turns out that Joe Rogan over here was supposed to be the guy busting the conspiracy theories and just let the fucking pedophile cabal go on and do public appearances on his podcast, just letting them in one after another.
Yeah.
What a cool guy. Anyway, good place for us to end the session. It's coming around. Only got a minute left here. Just remind everybody who's watching, if you like our, of course, delightful banter here at the end, you should become a donor to Cooperation Tulsa through the Open Collective link, which is down in the description. That'll get you access to the Cooperation Tulsa Discord server, and then you'll be able to attend these Jitsi meetups where we have these discussions. Yeah, and if you haven't, go subscribe to the Cooperation Tulsa YouTube. We're trying to get a number of people following the Cooperation Tulsa YouTube so that it can also kind of maybe take off and have videos of its own. So if you want to help us with that, go over there and subscribe. And I think that's it. Alternating Mondays, we're going to have an episode of the Popular Education Group, 7:30 on the coming Monday. And if you're interested in that, you should put it in your schedule. In any occasion, appreciate everybody showing up, both here in the Jitsi room and in the live stream. Y'all are wonderful, and I'll see y'all next time.
Thanks. Take care, everyone. Bye.